Welcome, class. For today, we're going to do a video on what I would call the elements of story. We're starting Unit 1, which is specifically on short stories. As part of the lesson today, you must watch the video and take notes, and then the notes must be turned into the assignment on Google Classroom. When we look at the elements of a story, we're specifically focusing on short stories to begin with, because if we start applying it to something that's smaller and then apply it to the larger novels, it helps us to make better sense and practice of what's taking place. We will divide the elements of a story into two different sections. Unit 1, which is what we're going to cover now, and Unit 4, which is what we will cover probably around November. To begin with, we're going to focus on the main basic elements of a story. We'll focus on the genre, the plot, the conflict, and the setting in this video. And then in your next video, we'll focus on characters, characterization, and point of view. The more in-depth analysis will happen when we get to Unit 4. Okay, to begin with, genre. Genre is a category or type of literature. Literature is basically divided into three different types of genres. We have poetry, prose, and drama. Poetry is not necessarily always the perfect rhyme, things like you get with Dr. Seuss and a variety of different poets. We have different styles that we'll be looking at when we look at Unit 2 with relation to poetry. But poetry usually falls into several different categories. We have epic, we have lyric, and we have narrative as our three most popular ones. Another genre is prose. Prose is what most of the class is focused around. Prose means fiction, both novels and short stories, as well as nonfiction, biography, autobiography, letters, essays, and reports, which is mainly what we did last year. This year is going to focus on the fiction aspect of prose. And then the last one we have is drama. Drama usually falls into two categories of tragedy and comedy, of which we will be covering each this year. Plot. This diagram should look familiar with relation to what has been studied for years in your English classes. Plot refers to the series of events or actions that take place in a work of fiction. A plot unfolds chronologically and has 5 main parts. So we start with the exposition. The exposition here in green is what we call the beginning of the story. It usually introduces characters, setting, and conflict. Make sure you take note of that: characters, setting, and conflict. When the conflict happens here at the end of the exposition, we start to see the rising action within the story, and the story builds to that climax. So the events get more intense as it gets closer and closer to the climax of the story. You have that climax or that inciting incident, that turn that shows the turn within the story itself. And then we go to the falling action, noticing here that the rising action usually takes place over a longer part of the story than the falling action, because the climax also shows that turning point and that end, that coming to a conclusion of the story. Once the falling action has come to an end, we have the resolution. Resolution also means denouement, or another word for it is denouement, and it means French for unknotting. So it's basically that idea of how everything is solved, how all of the conflicts become unknotted and make sense there at the end of the story. We will be covering, we will be practicing plot diagrams with relation to other stories that we will be discussing throughout the school year. Conflict. Conflict refers to the struggle between two opposing forces. It happens in everyday life. It has to deal with daily challenges that we face, as well as the forces that come in contact with them. We learn based on the conflict. And without conflict, we have no growth. So in literature, the author intentionally provides the conflict in order to keep the plot interesting, and without conflict, there is no story. There are two main forms of conflict. We have internal and external. Internal conflict is the type of conflict that takes place within the person's mind, and it's meaning their idea that they're in conflict with themselves. So it's person versus self. In order for them to make a change and come to a resolution, they need to understand what they're conflicted with within themselves and find a way to solve that conflict within themselves. The next one we have is external conflict. This is when a person is struggling with an outside force. There are 3 different forms that are the most popular. Again, it is possible to have more than one kind in a story, and it is possible to have more than these 3, but these 3 are the more popular of them. So we have person versus person. This is when a character has a problem with another character. This is usually like the antagonist versus the protagonist in that aspect. You also then have person versus society. This is when a character's problems lie with the laws or beliefs of a group of people. If we go back to 1,000 Splendid Suns, which you read last year, we have this idea that the ladies are facing that person versus society conflict. In the Muslim society, the women are treated differently. So they have to come to terms with and deal with the fact of how they are treated based on the society itself. And the last one we have is person versus nature. This is when a character's problems are with a force of nature. So they're fighting something like a tornado or an earthquake or something, an animal out camping or something along those lines, but it has to do with the environment itself. Okay, the last part of the video for today is this idea of setting. Setting is the environment in which a story or event takes place. It includes time and place. Okay, and the idea is you have to understand what makes up the elements of this setting. The important aspects are historical context and cultural environment. There are 4 main aspects. You need to know when it is, where it is, the historical context, as well as the cultural environment. We need to know when a story takes place so that we have the time aspect, because it's going to be different if it was 100 years ago versus today. We need the location, because the location would be a difference if it took place in the United States versus if it took place in Afghanistan. You need the historical context to understand the historical implications that are taking place. For example, if when we were reading Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, if you don't understand the aftermath aspect of 9/11, the story will not make sense with the idea of Oscar's conflict within himself and trying to solve that problem because of his father's death. And then you also have the cultural environment, which if we go to novels like The Kite Runner or 1,000 Splendid Suns, makes more sense because of the Muslim identity issues that are taking place within the story itself. As practice in your notes, I would like you to do this with 2 different novels that you've read throughout high school. I'm not including the 2 that we just did in summer reading because we have discussed all of this in depth. So I want you in your notes to write down the title, The Great Gatsby, and then in there I want you to put the when, the where, the historical context, and the cultural environment with relation to the story itself. Once you have finished with The Great Gatsby, I then want you to do the same thing for 1,000 Splendid Suns. Both of these need to be included in your notes as well as the notes on the previous slides. Okay, this is due by the end of class. Make sure that you upload it to Google Classroom, and I will see you in class tomorrow. Thank you.